Hi and welcome back to Programming for Biologists. Today we are going to be looking at for loops. If you want to follow along with this file, you can access this notebook in my GitHub, which is linked below. So you just need to look for session 5 for loops. Okay, so what are for loops? For loops basically iterate over objects, and they allow us to make repeatable actions over and over again on either iterables or a range of numbers, and they allow us to run sections of code multiple times without us having to type them out over and over again. So to practice with for loops, we'll first start with an iterable. So we're going to generate this list 1. This, we're just basically defining a list which contains 3 strings, which are like and subscribe. And then we have different ways of accessing this information, as you'll remember from the previous video. So we can access all of these elements by their index, which is super useful if we only want to access one element. So here we can say, oh, we'll just access the first element by using index 0, the second element by index 1, and the third element by index 2. And remember that Python counts from 0, so the first element is always 0. So if we run this, we can see that we can print out each individual string element in list 1. But what happens if you wanted to print out every element in a really, really long list? This is going to take forever because you're going to have to type out print and the index over and over again, which is just not practical. So you have a couple of options on how you can actually cycle through lists. So the first option would be to cycle through all the indexes of that list. Now we can do that, as I said, using a for loop. Now, this isn't really the best option in Python if you want to access individual elements in something iterable, but it might be your only other option in other programming languages. And you can still use it as an option in Python, and some people do say they wanted to access elements that were in the same position in different lists. So you could have 2 lists, and then you could say, I want the first element in list 1 and in list 2. But there are also better ways of doing that in Python. So this is the basic structure of our for loop. We have our for statement, and then we have here a variable that we're defining, and this will only be defined basically each time we run the loop. So this will become everything in, so this is what this is saying, this here. And here we have this range statement, which I'll explain in a little bit of detail in a minute. But basically, by saying what we're saying here is that we want every number between 0 and the length of our list. Now, if we run this, we can see that what's happening now is we're printing 0, 1, 2. So we could then use these numbers to access each element in our list, right? Because we have 0, 1, and 2. So what is actually happening here? So range is, as I said, a function that returns all the numbers between the first element that you put in, so in this case 0, and then this last element that we're putting in. So for here, instead of manually typing that our list is of length 3, we're saying get the length of list 1. So this is saying print every element between 0 and 3. Now it will print 0, but it's not going to print 3, it only prints up to 3. Only returns up to 3. And then we're printing these out, right? So like I say, this length statement basically just returns the length of the list. And if we run it on list 1, we can see it accurately says, yeah, list 1 is length 3. So if we want to see what range is doing, then we have to convert it into a list. Because when you run range, normally it's just going to, I can show you. So we have range 0 to 5. And I print this out. it's basically going to tell us that we have this range object from 0 to 5, right? But if we convert it to a list, we can see that we've got 0, 1, and 2. So range is very useful if you want to basically generate numbers between two different values. Okay, so let's use this now, right? So we can get every single index, which is going to be x in this case, and we can print that out. But also we can use this x value because it's giving us these integer values, which we can use as an index, and put it inside the square brackets as we would if we wanted to access the index in a list or a string. And if we run this, we can see that each time it's printing out the index, 0, and then the associated value inside that position of the list. So we have 0 is like, 1 is and, 2 is subscribe. Now, in Python, you don't really need to do this overly complicated thing of generating indices and then accessing those positions in a list. In Python, and this is the much more Pythonic way of writing this, is that basically you can just say for x in list 1, and what happens here is for each loop, x just becomes the value of each element in order from inside list 1. So if we run this, we can see that without having to mess around with generating indexes and passing those into the list again, that we can just print out each individual element inside the list. Now, this doesn't just apply to lists, right? Like we said, it can be any iterable object. And what you can do in Python is you can nest for loops inside of each other. So what we could say here is for x in list 1, which will be our words, and then for each time we loop over x, we can then loop over every single letter inside of x. So then we could say for y in x, and then we can print the y out for each word. And if we do this, we can see that we have in order like, so our like, and subscribe. So what's happening here is, because this loop is inside this loop, remember we have these indentations, that it's looping over our list once, and then for each item in the list, it's looping over every single letter in that and printing it out. Okay. So what we can do is separate this out just to make it a bit more easy. So where you put your print statements is very important because Python has an order of operations. So it's doing this first, then it's doing everything inside this, and then it's going to repeat this until it's finished, and then it's going to go back to this loop and then start all over again. So we can visualize this by each time we print out a word, each time we hit a word, and then we print out each individual letter. So if we print x here, we can see we're only getting these values once, and we're only getting these values once. And they go in the order that we have the word, like, L-I-K-E, and A-N-D, and then subscribe, right? So we're basically just defining temporary variables here. I'm not going to run this again because it will just give us the same output as above, but it doesn't matter what we call these things, right? We could just say what they are. We can give them useful names. We can say for word in list 1, and then for letter in word. And as long as we put word here and letter here, they'll give us exactly the same output as we had before, because we're saying print word, which is each element in list 1, and then we're saying print letter, which is each element in the word. So there's a few sort of like things that you need to remember when you're working with for lists. This doesn't just apply to for loops. It can apply to functions, and lots of things in Python rely on indentation. And I think this is why Python's a very good language to learn, because you have to write it in a very specific way for it to run. And if you don't write it in this very specific way, you're going to run into problems. and your code won't work properly. But it forces you to lay out your code nicely, and you can't just write a mess. And this makes the code much more readable when other people come to read it. And it also makes it much more readable for you when you come back to it in 6 months and you can't remember exactly what you did because you didn't comment your code properly. Okay, so like I said, indentations can either be 4 spaces or you can just use tab because, as I said, it will put in 4 spaces for you in Visual Studio Code when you use the tab. Also, the tabbing is important. So we can here, I've put in this extra text inside the print statement. We can see that this is printing every time in the loop. And then we have this one statement which prints after the loop. So what the code is doing is it's hitting this for loop, it's running this until it's finished, and then it moves on, and then it prints out the text after the loop. So something needs to be inside the loop if you want to work with it. And when you generate a new loop, if you don't have anything inside here, it's just going to raise an error. So if I just comment this out, you can see that we're getting this error because the for loop is expecting something inside it. And now all it has inside it is a comment called pass. And as we know, Python can't read the comments. So Python is just saying, oh, I've started this for loop and now I don't have anything inside my for loop. But if we put pass back in, so pass is basically a little statement that says, just carry on. You can put it in a placeholder when you're defining new function names, but you haven't actually written the function inside them. Or in this case, we can put it inside this for loop, and then it basically doesn't matter because it has at least something inside it. Now, we can talk a bit more about this in another session because we have things that control flow inside of loops. But that will become more important later. I think it's more important to practice the basics of how for loops work and get that down. Okay, so that is the basic of for loops. In the next session, we will be having a look at functions. There are other types of loops which you can use in Python, but for the most part, you'll be working with for loops when you're working with biological data and writing your code. So we can come on to while loops a bit later as they're a bit more complicated and you can get stuck inside them quite easily. And then you'll wonder why your code is still running even after it's finished. Okay, so thank you for listening. This is For Loops. This has been Programming for Biologists, and I will see you in the next one.